My name is Samuel Hartman, and this is the story of how my entire life changed on June 17th, 2014. I was an ordinary man, just your typical hard-working guy from a quiet town called Millstone Valley, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills. I spent most of my life working as an auto mechanic, fixing engines and tuning cars for the folks around town. My mother, Ruth, always had a strong faith. She believed in the power of prayer, in God's plan, and in the idea that everything happened for a reason. But me, I just couldn't bring myself to believe in things I couldn't see or prove. For me, life was simple. You worked hard, kept your head down, and trusted only what you could control. That all changed on one sweltering June afternoon. I had just finished a job at Walker's repair shop, where I'd spent hours fixing a busted transmission. The heat was brutal that day, and I remember feeling unusually drained as I packed up my tools and headed home. As I drove down that familiar stretch of Route 9, something felt off. My vision started to blur, like I was looking through a foggy windshield. My chest tightened, my heartbeat thudded violently in my ears, and my hands shook so badly I could barely keep my grip on the steering wheel. I knew something was seriously wrong, so I grabbed my phone and called my mom. "Mom," I croaked, barely able to speak. "I don't feel right." Her voice, firm yet calm, shot back without hesitation. "Sam, drive straight to Valley Ridge Hospital. Don't stop, just go." I did exactly what she said. I barely remember how I got there, but somehow, I stumbled through the ER doors before everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was floating above my own body. I could see the doctors rushing to my side, their voices urgent but muffled, like I was underwater. Nurses scrambled to prepare equipment, and I spotted Dr. Landry, a man I recognized from previous visits, shouting instructions. It should have terrified me, yet I felt this overwhelming sense of calm, like none of it mattered. It was as if I'd been lifted out of every worry, every pain, every fear. Then I felt something pulling me upward, gently but firmly, and before I knew it, I was drifting toward a brilliant cloud of light. The cloud seemed alive, glowing and pulsing with warmth, and from its center, a path appeared, stretching out before me. Standing near the path were 4 women in white gowns, each wearing a purple sash tied neatly at the waist. Their faces were blurred by the radiance surrounding them, but I could tell they were watching me closely. I wasn't afraid. I knew somehow they were there to protect me. As I drifted closer to the path, I became aware of a figure forming ahead of me. At first, it was faint, just a shadow against the light, but as I drew nearer, the shape became clearer. He was a man, dressed simply in worn jeans and a plain white shirt. His hair was curly and white, his face weathered yet gentle. What struck me most were his eyes. They radiated something I can only describe as pure love. It wasn't just kindness or warmth. It was deeper than that, like he could see every part of me, every mistake I'd ever made, and yet still cared for me as if I were his own child. Without speaking a word, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. The moment he embraced me, I felt something break inside me, like every wall I had ever built around my heart just crumbled. All my doubts, my fears, my regrets, they melted away in his presence. I was overwhelmed by this incredible feeling of love, a love that seemed to reach into the very core of who I was. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before. It was stronger, deeper, and far more real than anything I'd known. For the first time in my life, I knew without a doubt that this man was Jesus. Then, in the simplest yet most powerful gesture, Jesus leaned in and kissed me on the cheek. It was such a small act, yet it carried a meaning I couldn't explain. Felt as though he was telling me, "You are known, you are loved, you are forgiven." In that instant, I realized just how much I had doubted not only God but my own worth. All those years I'd spent feeling like I had to prove myself, to be strong, to fix things, to control my life, suddenly felt so small. I understood now that I was never truly alone. Even in the moments when I thought no one was watching, I was always seen, always guided, even when I didn't know it. As I stood there, still wrapped in that powerful sense of love, Jesus gently placed his hand on my forehead. The moment his fingers touched my skin, it was as if my entire life began playing before me. Not like a movie, but something far more real. I wasn't just watching memories. I was inside them, reliving each moment with incredible clarity. I saw myself as a little boy, playing in my front yard while my mom sat on the porch, smiling proudly. I felt the warmth of that memory as if I were right back there again. The smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of my mom calling me in for dinner. But not all the moments were joyful. I saw times when I had hurt people, moments I had pushed away, thinking they didn't matter. I remembered teasing a kid named Peter in middle school, calling him names because his family didn't have much money. At the time, it seemed harmless, but now I could feel his pain, the way my words had stuck with him long after that day. I watched myself as a teenager arguing with my mom, saying things I knew would hurt her just because I was angry. I could feel the sadness in her heart, the way she sat quietly in her room afterward, praying for me. It broke me to witness those moments, but what struck me most was that Jesus never looked at me with anger or disappointment. Instead, he stood beside me, calm, understanding, as if to say, "I know. I was there too." Then I saw the moments I had overlooked, the times I thought were insignificant. I remembered fixing Mrs. Goddard's car free of charge when I knew she couldn't afford to pay. I had barely thought about it afterward, but now I could feel how much that kindness had meant to her. I saw how those small acts, moments I had forgotten, created ripples that spread far beyond what I could have imagined. It was as if every choice, every action, and every word I had spoken had mattered far more than I'd ever realized. Nothing had been random. Nothing was without purpose. As those memories played out before me, I began to understand something I had never realized. My entire life had been guided in ways I couldn't see. Every moment, every decision, even the smallest choices had been connected to something greater. It was as if my life had been part of a carefully woven pattern, one I had been too blind to notice. The good moments, the bad ones, even the times I thought I was alone. None of it had been by chance. I remembered a time when I was driving home late one night. I was exhausted and nearly fell asleep at the wheel. For some reason, I had this sudden urge to pull over at a gas station, even though I didn't really need anything. When I stopped, I realized just how close I had been to nodding off. At the time, I thought I was just lucky, but now I understood. That feeling, that nudge to pull over, wasn't random at all. I could see now that something or someone had been guiding me all along, quietly steering me away from danger. It hit me hard. My life wasn't just a string of random events. There had been purpose behind it all. Even the struggles, the heartbreak, and the mistakes, they weren't just meaningless pain. Somehow, they had all been part of a greater plan. Jesus turned to me then, his eyes calm yet serious, and he spoke directly to my heart. Everything is connected. Every moment has meaning. Your life has always been guided, even when you thought you were in control. That realization overwhelmed me. I had spent so much of my life believing that I had to manage everything myself, that if I didn't take charge, things would fall apart. But now I knew the truth. I had never been in control. Not really. There was something greater at work, something powerful, loving, and intentional, and I had been part of it all along. As that truth settled in my heart, I felt a wave of emotions: relief, regret, and gratitude all at once. I thought back to all the times I had fought so hard to control my life, the late nights spent worrying about money, the anger I carried when things didn't go my way, the moments I lashed out at people because I felt overwhelmed. I realized now how much time I had wasted trying to manage things that were never really mine to control. It wasn't that my choices didn't matter, they did, but I had never been alone in making them. Even when I believed I was acting on my own, God had been there, quietly guiding me, steering me toward moments of love, growth, and purpose. I turned to Jesus then, feeling like I needed to apologize for everything. For the mistakes I'd made, for doubting him, for pushing away the very love I had now felt so clearly. But before I could speak, he smiled. A smile that told me I didn't need to explain. He already knew. He had seen it all, the pride, the stubbornness, the mistakes. And yet he still stood there, loving me just the same. I broke down right there, feeling like I didn't deserve any of it. Yet that love never wavered, not for a second. It surrounded me like a blanket, filling every part of me that had once felt empty. Then, without warning, I felt something pulling me back. It was as if an invisible hand was drawing me away from Jesus, back toward the world I had left behind. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay in that place of peace, to hold onto that love forever. But Jesus looked at me once more, still calm, still smiling. His voice echoed gently in my mind. "It's not your time yet. There's more for you to do." Those words stuck with me, even as the light began to fade and the warmth of his presence slowly slipped away. I felt myself falling, as if I were being pulled through layers of darkness until, just like that, I gasped awake in the hospital bed. I woke up to the sound of beeping monitors and muffled voices. My chest ached, and my body felt weak like I'd just run for miles. As my eyes adjusted to the dim hospital room, the first thing I saw was my mother, Ruth, sitting by my bedside. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The moment she realized I was awake, she grabbed my hand tightly, holding it like she was afraid to let go. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're back. You're really back." I could barely speak. My throat was dry, and I felt like I had just been dropped back into my body. But somehow, I managed to squeeze her hand and whisper, "I saw him. I saw Jesus." Tears filled her eyes again, and she leaned in close, whispering, I know you did." Over the next few days, doctors explained what had happened. I had suffered a severe allergic reaction to some antibiotics they'd given me, which had triggered my body to shut down. For several minutes, I had flatlined, no pulse, no breathing. Yet somehow I came back. The medical staff called it a miracle, but I knew the truth. What I had experienced wasn't just some hallucination or random dream. It was real, more real than anything I had ever felt before. And even though I was back in my body, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had changed forever. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had experienced. Every detail was burned into my mind. The warmth of Jesus' embrace, the way his eyes seemed to see right through me, the overwhelming feeling that my entire life had been guided all along. I kept replaying those moments, trying to make sense of it all. Why had I been shown this? Why had I been brought back when so many others never return? At first, I didn't know how to talk about it. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just imagining things, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. What I experienced wasn't just a vision. It was truth. I could still feel that love. A love so powerful that even now, back in my frail and broken body, it lingered inside me like a flame that refused to go out. Not long after I was discharged from the hospital, I began to notice things differently. My old habits, my short temper, my need to control everything no longer felt as strong. The things that once frustrated me didn't seem as important anymore. Instead, I felt this constant pull, a quiet yet undeniable urge to live differently. I couldn't just go back to the way things were before. I knew I had been given a second chance for a reason, and whatever that reason was, I couldn't ignore it. At first, I wasn't sure what living differently even meant. I went back to work at the auto shop, but everything felt different. The work itself was the same. Engines still broke down, parts still needed replacing, but my attitude had changed. Instead of just rushing through my jobs to finish as quickly as possible, I started paying attention to the people I was helping. I remember one afternoon, a man named Mr. Callahan came in with his old pickup truck. Normally, I would have just fixed the issue, handed him the bill, and moved on to the next customer. But something told me to slow down. After I finished working on his truck, I asked him how he was doing, really asked him. First, he just shrugged it off, but then his face changed. His eyes welled up, and before I knew it, he was pouring out his heart about how his wife had passed away just a month earlier. He was overwhelmed, lost, and unsure how to keep going. I didn't have the right words to fix his pain, but I knew what I could do. I just listened. For nearly an hour, I sat with him in that garage, letting him share his heart. Before he left, he shook my hand tightly and said, "You have no idea how much I needed this." That moment stayed with me. It reminded me of what Jesus had shown me, that even the smallest actions matter, that every encounter can be an opportunity to reflect his love. I realized then that this was part of why I had been sent back, to live with purpose, to slow down, and to be present in ways I never had before. As time went on, those moments kept finding me. Moments where I felt that quiet pull, like God was placing people in my path for a reason. There was a woman named Mrs. Granger who came in one morning, panicked because her car wouldn't start. After I fixed her battery, I noticed she seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else. I felt that same urge again, the one I couldn't ignore since my experience, and I asked her if she was okay. That's when she broke down right there in the garage, telling me how her son had been struggling with addiction and she didn't know how to help him. I didn't have any magical advice or perfect words, but I stood with her, letting her cry until she could catch her breath. Moments like that kept happening, not just at work, but everywhere. At the grocery store, at the gas station, even just walking down the street. I started noticing people's pain in a way I never had before, like their burdens were somehow easier to see. And whenever I felt that quiet nudge in my heart, I followed it. Sometimes it was just a simple conversation. Other times it was offering a small act of kindness. But each time, I remembered what Jesus had shown me, that no moment is random, that even the smallest gestures can create ripples that stretch farther than we ever realize. Of course, not everyone understood the change in me. Some of my friends thought I was acting strange, like I'd become overly emotional or too focused on things that didn't seem important. Even Pastor Morgan from my church, a man I had known for years, seemed hesitant when I first shared my story. He listened quietly, but his face told me he wasn't sure what to make of it. "Sam," he said afterward, "I believe you experienced something powerful, but we have to be careful about what we claim to know." His words stung, but deep down I knew what I had seen was real. No matter what anyone said, I couldn't forget what I felt in Jesus' presence. That overwhelming love, that undeniable truth that every moment in our lives is guided in ways we may never fully understand. For a while, those doubts stuck with me. I started questioning myself, wondering if maybe I was just imagining things or reading too much into moments that weren't really special at all. But every time I felt unsure, I'd think back to that moment, standing before Jesus, feeling his arms around me, hearing him say, "Everything is connected." That memory was like an anchor, keeping me steady when I felt uncertain. One evening, when I was feeling particularly overwhelmed, I sat with my mom on her front porch. I hadn't told her how much I'd been struggling, but somehow she knew. She reached over, grabbed my hand and said, "Sam, don't you forget what he showed you. If he brought you back, it's because there's something you're meant to do, and that something isn't always going to be easy." Her words stuck with me. I realized then that living with purpose doesn't always feel powerful or miraculous. Sometimes it's just about showing up, trusting those quiet moments, and believing that love, real unconditional love, is what matters most. Slowly, things started to make more sense. I stopped trying to force everything to happen the way I thought it should and instead focused on being present, really present in each moment. I let go of the need to control everything and instead trusted that God was working through me in ways I couldn't always see. And you know what? That's when I started to notice something incredible. Those small moments, the ones I used to overlook, were adding up to something far bigger than I realized. The conversations, the kindness, the quiet moments of listening, they were all part of something greater. It wasn't just me reaching out to people. God was using me to reach them. About a year after my experience, I finally understood just how powerful those moments really were. I was working late at the shop one evening when a man named Jeremy walked in. His truck had broken down a few miles outside of town, and he was desperate to get it fixed before morning. He seemed anxious, not just stressed, but like something deeper was weighing on him. Normally, I would have just done my job and sent him on his way, but I felt that familiar nudge in my heart, the one I had learned not to ignore. While I worked on his truck, I asked him how things were going. At first, he gave a short answer, but when I kept listening, he finally opened up. He told me his life was falling apart. His marriage was crumbling, his job was on the line, and he felt like he was barely holding on. He admitted that earlier that evening, before his truck broke down, he had actually been driving with no destination, just driving to clear his head and try to figure out if life was even worth it anymore. His voice shook as he said those words, and I knew right then that I hadn't met him by accident. I told him about my experience. Not the entire thing, but enough for him to know that I believed God had a purpose for him, even if he couldn't see it yet. I told him how I once thought everything was random, that life was just a series of events we had to manage on our own, but that I was wrong. I explained how I had learned that no moment is meaningless, that even the hardest times can lead to something greater. Jeremy didn't say much at first, but before he left, he shook my hand tightly and said, "I don't know why I ended up here tonight, but I think maybe I needed to." That moment changed me. It reminded me that we may never know how our actions, even something as simple as asking someone how they're doing, can impact someone's life. I realized that God wasn't just guiding my life. He was using my story, my kindness, and my presence to guide other people too. I finally understood that the love I felt when I stood before Jesus wasn't just for me. It was meant to be shared. From that day forward, I stopped second-guessing those moments. I didn't always understand why I felt drawn to certain people or why I felt that quiet tug in my heart, but I knew enough to trust it. Whether it was offering someone a kind word, staying a few extra minutes to listen, or simply being present when someone seemed like they needed it, I followed that feeling. It didn't always lead to life-changing conversations, and most of the time I never knew what impact, if any, I was making. But I realized that wasn't the point. The point was to show love, to let God work through me, even if I couldn't see the full picture. I started to believe that sometimes we're just called to plant seeds. Seeds we may never see grow, but they matter all the same. I still think about that day with Jesus often. Whenever life feels overwhelming, whenever doubt tries to creep back in, I remind myself of what he told me. Everything is connected. Your life has always been guided, and I know now that it's true, not just for me, but for all of us. Every conversation, every choice, every struggle, it's all part of something greater than we can imagine. We may not always understand it in the moment, but God sees the whole picture. We just have to trust that even when we feel lost, He's leading us exactly where we're meant to be. If my story has touched you in any way, I encourage you to take a moment and reflect on your own life. Think about the people you've met, the obstacles you've faced, and the moments that seemed small but somehow felt important. I promise you, nothing is random. It's all connected in ways we may not see until much later. And if you've ever felt alone or forgotten, know this: you are never unseen. You are loved, you are guided, and your life has a purpose greater than you can imagine. If you found this story meaningful, please consider sharing it with someone who may need to hear it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss more powerful stories like this one. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope my experience brings you as much hope and peace as it brought me.